Good morning, students. Welcome to this morning's contact-based session for Educational Foundations 1. I'm Ms. Isabel Besaidenout, and I'd like to go through some of the most important content, especially with the coming exam in mind. Let's start by first of all looking at comparative education. What is comparative education? It is the comparative study of educational theories and practices in various countries, and it attempts to use cross-national data to test prepossessions about the relationship between education and society and between teaching practices and learning outcomes. It also considers the implications of comparative studies for the formation and implementation of policies in education and social, national, and international development. Furthermore, it invites contributions from associated disciplines in the fields of government, management, sociology and technology, and communications, which affect educational research and policy decisions. Now, more specifically, let's look at what Hans says about comparative education. He first of all sees it as something to assist in the understanding of one's educational institutions as well as educational practices. It assists in the understanding of the factors that are responsible for various educational changes, and it also educates the students and teachers on the procedures through which educational changes occur. It also contributes not only to the educational development of society, but also to the general development of society. And last of all, it serves as an academic discipline. The next important aspect I want to look at is how education can promote mutual respect and understanding in society. Education allows us to learn about life in other societies and about education at all school levels in developed and developing nations, and in a secular and non-secular and formal and informal educational setting. It studies the what, the how, and the why of teacher education in different social settings. It also allows us to develop a broader view of the profession and to use a variety of strategies to gather data. Lastly, it ensures the accuracy and comparative nature of teachers' knowledge. The third aspect I want to concentrate on now is that you need to know specific concepts that are important in educational foundations. I'm not going to go through each and every definition here, but I want to highlight some of the concepts that I want you to go and study and understand as well. First of all, be sure to know what is meant by competency-based education. Secondly, what is information and communication technology? You also need to know what is the meaning of the word secular, juvenile, holism, and violation. Furthermore, what is meant if we talk about a philosophy, a charter, as well as the concept quasi-property. Now, all of these concepts are in your study guide, and you will find them in the glossary at the end of each and every chapter, which is very important to also have a look at. The next aspect that I want to concentrate on is something to do with one of the very important educational thinkers that we deal with, and that is Plato. Specifically, his relevance, his thoughts that are relevant to the modern day informal educators, and we can see it on a number of levels still today. Firstly, Plato believed and demonstrated that educators must have a deep care for the well-being and future of those they work with. Education was seen as a moral enterprise, and it was the duty of the educator to search for the truth and virtue, and in doing so, to guide those that have a responsibility to teach. Charles Hummel also supports this when he says the teacher should never be a mere peddler of materials for study and of recipes for winning disputes, nor yet for promoting a career. In other words, teaching is so much more than just this. Secondly, Plato also supported the Socratic teaching method. This means that the teacher should know his or her subject. As a true philosopher, he should also know the limits of his or her knowledge. What is also important is to focus on the power of dialogue. In other words, the joint exploration of a subject. Knowledge will not come from teaching, but from questioning, in other words. Thirdly, there is Plato's conceptualization of the differing educational requirements associated with various life stages, which supports the Greek concern for body and mind. We also see here the importance of exercise and discipline, and also of storytelling and games. Children enter school at 6, where they first learn the 3 R's: reading, writing, and counting, and they then engage in music and sports. Plato's philosopher guardians then follow an educational path until they are 50, and this is as follows. At 18, they undergo military and physical training. At 21, they entered higher studies, and at 30, they began to study philosophy and serve the polis in the army or civil service. At 50, Plato believed they were ready to rule. This is a model for what we now describe as lifelong learning. Indeed, some of the 19th century German writers describe Plato's scheme as andragogy. It is also a model of the learning society. The polis is serviced by educators, and it can only exist as a rational form if its members are trained and continue to grow. The next very important aspect that we as educators should take note of is the rights and the responsibilities of the teacher. Now, we're first of all going to look at what are the responsibilities and why it's important for teachers to take note of these. Responsibilities and certain rules are there to ensure that teachers do not discharge their responsibilities. Authority should establish and regularly use recognized means of consultation with teachers' organizations on such matters as educational policy, school organization, and new developments in the education service. Furthermore, authorities and teachers should recognize the importance of the participation of teachers through their organizations and in other ways in steps designed to improve the quality of the education service, in educational research, as well as in the development and dissemination of new improved methods. Authorities should also facilitate the establishment and the work of panels designed within a school or within a broader framework, with the aim of promoting the cooperation of teachers of the same subject, and they should take due account of the opinions and suggestions of such panels. Lastly, administrative and other staff members who are responsible for aspects of the education service should seek to establish good relations with teachers, and this approach should be equally reciprocated. In other words, the respect and the cooperation should come from both sides. Now, if we look at the educational rights, the focus points are as follows. The teacher should have knowledge of the national protection and service agencies, in other words, the legal system and other available mechanisms. Advocacy, educational and training materials. Especially of importance here is the international human rights standards and education. When it comes to policymakers, the significance of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child for modern education policy is important. And then very specifically for teachers or educators, they need to take note of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We move over to the next important aspect, and if we look at the history of education in Namibia, it is inevitable that we must also look at what the influence of missionary education was on Namibian society and culture. When the missionaries came to in those days called Southwest Africa, the mission stations were planned as military centers, even the churches as such. The missionary campaign to Christianize Africa not only converts the heathens into Christians, but they also tried to convert the Africans into Europeans. That caused that many of the African traditions started to disappear, not so much because of theologically based criticism, but rather because of the cultural imperialism of the early European missionaries. Historical and anthropological studies show that the advent of the Christian mission changed the cultural imagination of the Africans fundamentally. The efforts of the Christian missionaries were decisive in the imposition of a new mode of being. They wanted to reconstruct the religion, the aesthetics, the knowledge, the bodily representation, sexuality, gender relations, and actually every aspect of people's living in Namibia. The cultural implications of the Christian missions caused a cardinal reconstruction of the identity as well as the social space. Most missionaries in Namibia were most fervently opposed to the traditional type of lifestyle, and they saw it as pagan customs. Two of the Lutheran missionary societies, the Rhenish and the Finnish missionary societies, were especially strict regarding the above. When we look at the Anglican and the Roman Catholic churches, they were more permissive and they allowed the indigenous customs and cultural expressions, but it was not enough to contribute to the preservation and the survival of the customs. Particularly if we look at Carl Hugo Hahn from the Rhenish Missionary Society, he tried to establish a politically and economically autonomous mission colony in Ochimbingwe by mission through colonization. In 1971, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in West Africa and the Evangelical Lutheran Ovambo Kavango Church came together to form the United Evangelical Church of Namibia. And the Christian community of this federated church of over 300,000 formed 50% of the total population of Namibia in 1970, which is really quite a significant fact to take into account. Now, if we look at the Africa Evangelical Fellowship, who entered Namibia in the early 1970s, they came to work with the Herero people in and around Windhoek. The Herero had been reached with the gospel many decades earlier, but at that stage they were still seen as unevangelized. Then, in 1981, the AEF and the church began to work among the Angolan refugees along the northern border. The AIM entered the country and formed a partnership with the AEF. Now they were a joint team to define the work of the SIM and the AIM in Namibia. A debate started in Germany regarding its colonial empire and the activities of the RMS in distant Africa, fanning imaginations. The unclaimed area to the north of the Cape Colony was proclaimed German Southwest Africa in 1880, but they then started to run into various problems since Germany was inexperienced at colonization. The Herero and the Namakwa genocide during 1904 to 1907 proved to be the nadir, or the lowest point, of their rule, and that combined with the effects of World War I caused that Germany was unable to maintain a foothold so far from home. South Africa then annexed the area in 1950, renaming it Southwest Africa. During this time, missionaries' reactions ranged from compassion and help for the local tribes to patriotism and support of the colonial interest. Formal schooling, first introduced to the indigenous people by European missionaries, was used to teach them how to read religious literature so that they could facilitate the spread of the gospel. Our next subject. If we look to the future and if we have the importance or the success of our educational system in mind, we need to have a look at what are our problems and our challenges, especially facing the 21st century. We see now that 14 years after independence, the country was still unable to provide adequate skilled human resources and still continued to experience high rates of unemployment and underemployment, as it still is today. We also have a situation where current levels of expenditure on education may not be sustainable in the long run, owing to our low economic growth and our increasing government budget deficits. Then there is still a need to improve the conditions for teaching and learning, especially in the rural areas, in order to improve the quality of educational outcomes, particularly in critical areas such as mathematics, science, and English. The Ministry of Basic Education and Culture is in the process of organizing and strengthening advisory service structures by establishing educator development and support units in all education sectors. There's a number of policies which are all essential to the successful implementation of education for all, which have been developed and are in place. But there are still challenges in ensuring coordination of efforts towards their wide dissemination and implementation by all stakeholders. Furthermore, our population growth has been affected by the worsening HIV and AIDS infection, which has led to many deaths, particularly among the young, productive age groups. This has resulted in a number of children becoming orphans. The government makes provision for all children, irrespective of their special educational needs, to benefit from the same education through mainstream education. But the reality is that in Namibia, the children with severe learning difficulties receive education and training in few special schools. Coupled with these challenges, the government is also faced with a daunting task of decentralizing functions to regions, the high unemployment rate, particularly among the youth, and the inadequate financial resources available to address these issues. Now we go over to inclusive education, and this goes hand in hand if we look at a policy which supports education for all. Inclusive education is a very important means to enhance education. If we look at our classes in Namibia, we have a wide-band mixed ability range of learners and learners with special educational needs which are often in the mainstream schools. Inclusive education is a learner-centered concept that requires that the school organizes special learning programs to meet individual learners' needs when these cannot be met through individualization within a subject-organized approach and fixed timetabling. All schools should have the capacity first to identify and secondly to support these learners. The majority of the needs can be met in the mainstream schools, but there are some people who do require individual support. This support may range from in-class help, extraction for specific activities, additional after-school help, additional homework, counseling, etc. Addressing such identified needs requires schools to activate counseling and support groups as well as learning support groups. This is to ensure that individual needs are identified and an individual education plan is agreed on, where appropriate, and education and support programs are monitored. During this process, the parents, the guardians, and the learners are also involved, and they need to agree on the specific responsibilities within the individual educational plan. We do have some impairments that have no consequences for learning ability, and with that we mean specifically the physical impairments. These learners, however, may develop difficulties in learning if we don't make adjustments in the classroom and the teaching methods. They can be supported by the use of methods of teaching that enable the learners to follow the lessons and participate in the learning process, and provision of necessary facilities, learning aids, and support materials. When we think of what kind of support we can give them, we think of, for instance, wide doors, and ramps for wheelchairs, modified toilet facilities and appropriate furnitures. We can also have learning aids and support materials which include large print books and adjusting visual aids, for example magnifying text for learners with low vision, sound books, voice software and braille printers for learners with visual impairment. And for the deaf learners, for example, we can make use of interpreters. Then we come to impairments that do have consequences for learning ability. Those are the ones that are emotional, social and behavioral. And some of them are, for instance, attention deficit disorder, Down syndrome and fetal alcohol syndrome. Now extra attention must be given to the specific needs, the aptitudes and the strengths of these pupils, and we need to use appropriate teaching methods and specially adapted materials. The progress and the achievement of these learners are to be evaluated in relation to their starting point and their potential. Learners with these difficulties may not be able to achieve what other learners do, but nonetheless we must recognize their achievements. It's also important that we focus on social acceptance of the differentiability of learners with impairments and see them as equal members of the class and the school. This value should be held equally by all members of staff, all learners in the class and school, and all parents and guardians as well. The success of each learner in an inclusive class will depend on the provision of enabling conditions for such based on an understanding that all learners are equal and that no one should be left behind. The Caring Integrated Society of Namibia Vision 2030 begins in the classroom, where the degree of impairment or learning disability is such that a learner cannot benefit from full inclusion in a mainstream class, will special needs education be provided further along a continuum of inclusion. Learners might, for instance, be referred to a unit within the mainstream school or to a special school, depending on their needs. The objective is always to provide for the particular educational needs of the learner in the most appropriate way, always with the same goal of preparing all for inclusion in society. Next of all, we have a look at an important aspect that we as educators should also keep in mind. And that has to do with the role that educational psychology plays in our education system. So more specifically, if we look at this heading, educational psychology insight as a factor that influences the educational system in Namibia. As soon as a child is identified as someone with developmental problems, which usually are manifested as emotional, behavioral or learning deviations, and the question is asked about how the symptoms can possibly be eliminated, the area of professional educational psychology is entered. Educational psychological activities are directed to a professional field in which proficiency and skillfulness are required, and this accentuates the fact that it is a science directed towards the practice of educating. It also has to fulfill the requirement of being scientific, which means there's an emphasis on the scientific nature of the work, the attitude and the method. Its theories have to express a vision of the child, the family, the school and society. However, its practically directed scientific activities in the first place are not for the sake of knowledge, but for the sake of correct actions regarding the handling of concrete problems. Also, its theory forming thrives on continual interaction with practice. Where education and psychology are involved in thoughtfully cultivating and ordering data regarding specific aspects of a developing person. Just as a theory of teaching has little meaning if its foundation is not in the practice of a teaching-learning situation, so a theory of psychotherapy has little meaning if it is not rooted in a situation of personal actualization. Similarly, a theory of child psychotherapy has little meaning if its basis is not found in a child's practical situation of personal actualization. We can compare it to the following. You can train a teacher via a method. However, without a founding didactic theory, the teacher will not be able to design an original lesson and make a judgment of his or her practice. So, their accountability and initiative will be lacking. Understanding and effectively designing a practice for a child with barriers to learning requires as a first precondition the clarification of such a barrier and in its essentials. In other words, you truly need to understand the nature of the barrier. It also requires specific basic knowledge of a particular phenomenon, which is necessary to clarify, understand, and master it. Such scientific knowledge means a thorough understanding of a particular delimited area of study. This is acquired by special methods or modes of attack, by thoroughly describing, ordering, classifying, and finally explicating the information by disclosing particular laws or regularities that the data include. The insights of the educational psychologists on influencing the education system are very complex because there's a diversity of focal points which are distinguished within the broad terrain of educational psychology. An educational psychologist is not merely an educationist with a bit of psychological knowledge or a psychologist who has acquainted himself with education. Educational psychologists have value to add to the system regarding how teachers should handle children. And they are very influential in the Education for All movement and strongly represented in inclusive education. Furthermore, educational psychologists are focused on how to integrate children with special needs or barriers to learning into the mainstream schooling, and it might be needed in every school to help realize the dream of education for all. That concludes the content which is important, specifically not just for your own teaching practices, but keeping in mind with what you should focus on for preparing for the August examination. I want to quickly run through some of the important action verbs, and I'm doing this specifically when I think of the past exam which I've just marked, and I realize that some students are still really struggling to interpret the action verbs and they don't quite know how to handle the questions that are asked. So first of all, let's see why are action verbs important. The thing is, they tell you what kind of thinking is involved in the question. In section 7 in the beginning of your study guide, you'll find a long list of these action verbs. But three of the verbs that I'd like to look at are discuss, analyze, and evaluation. There are others too, you can go through the list, but specifically today, see if you understand what I mean by the following. When we ask you to discuss something, we don't just want you to simply give us the facts. More importantly, we don't just want you to make bullet points of phrases that you've memorized. I want you to answer in paragraph form. I want you to write full, grammatically correct sentences. And you should give, as it says here, a clear description, and you should also be able to argue about features relating to the question, pointing out the positive and the negative of it, and I want to see that you arrive at a conclusion. Now, all of this means that you as a student shouldn't just reproduce what you've memorized. You should show me that you thought about it, that you can be critical, and that you can give me some of your own opinions and thoughts on this specific topic. Then if we look at analyze, It's quite similar, but when we analyze, we say that we examine the information in detail and we try to discover main ideas, components or patterns, or even relationships, depending on what was asked. We also need to be able to show how these are important and how they are related, and also what theories they reflect. Now, it might not be true for every single question, but the main thing that comes through here again is you cannot, if I ask you to analyze something or to examine something, just write down the facts that you memorized. I need something from you. I need your thoughts. I need your opinion. I need you to show me that you can think about what you've learned and that you can reflect on the information. So you really need to understand what you have learned, not just remember certain words. Finally, and this is the highest form of thinking that might be required of you, if you are asked to evaluate something, it implies that you need to decide and explain how great, valuable, or important something is. And then this intrinsically implies that you made a judgment. So in other words, if you made a judgment, you should be able to back it up by evidence or some sound reasoning. And then I want to stress before I leave you, please, when you study, make sure that you understand what you are learning. When we try to remember things that we don't really understand, it's very, very difficult to reproduce it in the examination, and it's easily to get it all muddled up. I want to encourage you to use your dictionary when you prepare for the examination. We see that there are many difficult concepts, there are words that are difficult and foreign to us in this specific subject. You have to see that you understand the meaning of each of them. What I think might be very useful is if you see that it's a very difficult word and you'll struggle to understand and remember it, go and take your dictionary or take a thesaurus, replace the word with an easier word that will help you to understand and to remember it better. If you reproduce information in the examination in your own words, you will still get all the marks as long as it's the relevant information. So what I'm actually trying to say is that I noticed in the previous exam is that people don't really understand what they've memorized. So don't make that mistake. Tackle this examination, use the content in the presentation, and make sure that you truly understand what you are learning. I wish you the best of luck, and then I want to encourage you to send me an SMS if you need me to call you about something that you are struggling with, and of course you are also very welcome to send me an email, and then I can respond to you as well if there's something that you need help with. Thank you, students, and all the best with your preparations. Goodbye.